Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions and those who will in the future be joining us on C-SPAN Book TV. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. And for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We will, of course, post the program on our website following today's presentation for everyone's future reference as well. We do encourage you to consider purchasing copies of Digital World War. It's available on Amazon.com, and I'm sure our author will be glad to have that support as we come into Christmas. Maybe a little odd topic for Christmas, but the techies out there may like it. Leading our discussion and welcoming our special guest is Robin Simcox, our Margaret Thatcher Fellow in the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Before arriving at Heritage, he was a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society, a foreign policy think tank in London. He has testified numerous times before Congress, as well as provided oral evidence before parliamentary committees, examining laws and governance of Britain's intelligence agencies. He received a Master of Science degree in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Institute for the Study of the Americas at the University of London, and he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in International History from the University of Leeds. Please join me in welcoming Robin Simcox. Robin?
Thank you, John, and welcome to everyone. Welcome everyone to the Heritage Foundation. It's a great pleasure to be able to invite back today Dr. Haroon Ullah. Haroon serves as the Chief Strategy Officer at the Broadcasting Board of Governors, the global media agency. He's a scholar, diplomat, policy practitioner with a special focus on digital strategy, countering violent extremism, and transmedia engagement. Haroon most recently served on Secretary Tillerson's policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department. He teaches at Georgetown University and is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as Senior Harvard University Belfer Fellow, has an MA and PhD in International Political Economy, and was a William J. Fulbright Fellow, a Harvard University Presidential Scholar, and a Woodrow Wilson Public Service Fellow. What else is there to say? And he is here today to speak on his fascinating new book, Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cyber Supremacy. So with no further ado, Haroon, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Robin, and thanks to Heritage Foundation. I'm absolutely thrilled to be with you here today to talk to you about something that I'm very passionate about, and this is sort of thinking about the information battlefield, a battlefield that is either not well understood or not well thought of in terms of when we think about how to keep U.S. safe and we think about U.S. national security. But I want to start off with a story. And for my book, I did a lot of work with a lot of interviews. My background is in data. It's sort of a data-driven approach. And so I built a database of defectors, if you think about ISIS defectors. And I wanted to think carefully about what are the reasons that young people are either attracted to this type of propaganda, and what are the things that really sort of make somebody get up and either buy a ticket or join, or online, in a way I call fanboys, support their ecosystem. And so I was in the Gulf interviewing a young lady that was a defector, and she had come back recently. Her name is Ronnie. And I was asking her very early on in the interview, I asked her, just give me a one-word identification when you think of ISIS. And in my head, I'm ready to sort of take notes, and I thought about the one-word answers that me and you would give, which would be horrendous or horrific or murderers. Very dark, very, I think, accurate ways to describe their sort of hateful rhetoric and their hateful sort of approach. And she started listing off her one-word answer identifications. And the words that came out were identity, belonging, trust. And sort of I did one of those things when you do a double take. I said I wanted to make sure, I was speaking to her in Arabic, and we were trying to get a good sense, and I wanted to make sure that this is what she was saying. And it struck me because I said, well, how do you describe this disconnect? How do you describe this disconnect? Because when I think of them, I have very strong opinions about what it is, but how is it that she came to a very different conclusion? And what that led me down the path is that there was, if you think about propaganda and you think about how they're communicating with young people, when I went and read, and as I did research for the book on this ecosystem that's been built online, I realized that they're saying one thing in Arabic and they're saying something very different in English, which leads me to what I want to talk about today, which is I want to give you some key insights from what I've explored in terms of what the group is doing and what other groups like them are doing. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what are solutions, because I think there's a lot of analysis paralysis when it comes to thinking about extremist groups, but really, what is it that we can do together? What can we harness in terms of a blueprint to sort of fight well and fight back on this information battlefield? So I'll start off with one of my first key insight. Key insight flowing from the story I just told you about Ronnie is audience segmentation. And audience segmentation matters. So as one of my colleagues and good friend Jonathan Perlman oftentimes says, content is king, distribution is queen, and she wears the pants in the family. And if you think about that, the way I like to think about ISIS and others is that, we're in a content war. Really, it's a content war when you think about it on this information battlefield. And they really understand what I would say customer journey. So they understand, how to reach niche audiences. This idea that narrower the audience, bigger the impact. So they really have thought through. And if you look at, for a lot of people, we read a lot of the ISIS material in English. And in my research, I found that English is not even in the top 5 languages of what their material in terms of what they're producing, both on social media and other ways that they sort of get their message out. It's not even in the top 5. It's Arabic, it's Russian, it's French, it's other languages. And so when you start thinking about the way they're reaching out to people, and you start reading what they're sending out, then you get a very different picture. Another misconception that sort of what I stumbled upon in my research is that a lot of their messaging, as I mentioned, those one-word associations, those are very dark. We think in a lot of ways that ISIS is selling this medieval, gloomy narrative, right? Sort of a very sort of, almost kind of an Armageddon. But when you read a lot of their messaging in Arabic, 80% of it, upwards of 80% of it, is what I call positive messaging. So it's not that they're saying that they're saying that stuff in English oftentimes to instill fear, or in other languages depending on audiences. But what we find is that they do a lot of positive messaging, and it's sort of talking about governance. It's talking about rooting out corruption. And so when they're reaching out to young people that are disenfranchised, let's say in the Middle East, in the region, they're talking about the Arab Spring and the failed Arab Spring. They're talking about political grievances, and they're offering a narrative that's aspirational for young people in terms of their identity. And so when you think about that, then you say, okay, so that's why when they put this social media, when it's they put a picture of a bushel of apples, and they'll say the caliphate is bountiful, right? And they're talking a lot about, or the taking pictures of handing candies to young kids. So they're talking about things that are largely positive messaging, and you get a better sense of their propaganda. The other thing that struck me is that as part of this insight around audience segmentation who are the key influencers that are part of this ecosystem. So who are the people that oftentimes help them scale up their message, right? It's not just they have their storyboarding, they have their outlets, but it's these network of surrogates and fanboys and key influencers that help elevate their message. And one person that kept on coming up again in interview after interview, and as I did research, was a gentleman named Muhammad al-Arafi. Now, I would guess that most of us here probably haven't read much of him, not sure who he is. And even in the region, when I talk to people, it's not something that readily come across. Who's Muhammad al-Arafi? Well, Muhammad al-Arafi is the most popular person in the Middle East on Twitter, right? And that's kind of sometimes a shocking fact. A lot of us might, I ask people, well, who's the most popular on Twitter in the Middle East? I'll get answers like King Abdullah, or maybe it's an actor or an actress, or maybe it's some other politician. But it's Muhammad al-Arafi. He's an extremist cleric. He's based in Saudi Arabia, and he has over 20 million followers on Twitter. But he's not just prolific on Twitter. He's prolific on Snap. He's prolific across platforms. And he's probably one of the single biggest drivers of why young people will buy a ticket and they've gone to Raqqa, they've gone to Syria and Iraq. And yet he doesn't violate terms of service, but his narrative complements a lot of what they're doing. And young people are watching him. Over 30% of youth in Saudi Arabia alone follow him, and he has a huge following across the Gulf and across the world. As I say, if you look at the 100 most followed people on Twitter in the world, he's right after Hillary Clinton and right before Ed Sheeran. And you get a sense that, I mean, he has a huge constituency and platform. And if you think about counter narratives, you think about how to combat. Well, just look at Mohammed al-Arafi and see the type of charisma he exudes online, and you get a sense of why young people buy into some of his ways of thoughts and actually will get up and do something based on some of the things that he says. So that's the first point I want to leave with you, is that audience segmentation matters, that we are in this, what I call, content war. The second thing I wanted to focus in on is this idea that real-time feedback loops, that, the headline for me is speed kills. That, what we find ISIS and other extremist groups like them is that they are perfecting their pitch. Like any good marketing strategy and any good strategy is that they'll try certain things in terms of what works on young people, but they will oftentimes, they can move very quickly and they're much more nimble in how they can change their approach. They are putting at times, it varies, but at times 5,000 to 10,000 pieces of social media a day. At times, at the height of it, it was about 25,000 to 35,000 if you look at the whole ecosystem. But what they're able to do is that they're able to change based on their audiences. They're able to perfect that pitch. They're able to change something even before the Halloween attack. And after the Halloween attack, you saw how they're on Telegram and other channels. As I was monitoring and looking at what they're doing, you saw them actually putting out memes based on a cracked Statue of Liberty, and how they're taking credit for things. So you see sort of their approach and how they're reaching out to young people, vulnerable youth, and at-risk youth. So that's an important thing, is that the real-time feedback. And this is important when I talk about solutions, because a lot of times, they've set up this David and Goliath narrative, right? So that they can win on both. They can win even if they're losing on the physical battlefield. They can win on the information battlefield because they can turn the narrative upside down in terms of who they're fighting against, and they're fighting against the grand coalition, the global coalition that's taking them on. The third thing I'll leave you with in terms of insights is this idea that platform agility matters. So, akin to audience segmentation and what we talk in terms of real-time feedback loops, there's this idea that ISIS is able to move between different platforms. So one thing I found that they're very skillful at, and again, adds a lot of, makes them more influential than their size than we would estimate, is their ability to move both from open source platforms and use those platforms for certain things, Twitter, Facebook, things that we might be familiar with, to closed platforms or to end-to-end encryption, so to WhatsApp, Telegram, and apps that we are not as familiar with, like things like Riot, or a new app that actually a lot of people haven't paid attention to, but it's called Saraha. And Saraha is it's what's called the Honesty app, and it's actually in about 20 plus countries. It's now surpassed Snapchat as the most downloaded app, most popular app. It actually was developed by a young Saudi entrepreneur, and it was meant to sort of provide, the way I like to think about Saraha is that it's like an old school high school bulletin board to post anonymous messages. And it was developed to sort of give workplace feedback in terms of for young people to sort of, in the workplace, to give feedback to colleagues. And as it's developed over time, it's also been used for bullying and now being used to recruit. And so the thing is that we are all talking about Twitter and Facebook, which they were online in 2014. And as we continue to talk about Twitter and Facebook, they're actually moved on, right? And Rob and I were talking about this the other day, is that, if you think about the visual image, just about a month ago, in the last few weeks, we had representatives of the tech companies testifying on the Hill, Twitter, Google, and Facebook. And that's important. And I think censorship plays a role in thinking about how to take them off their ecosystems. I think that does play a role. But think about it, sort of we're like 3 years late on that. They came online in 2014. We're discussing it now. I don't want us to be talking about Saraha in 2 years, right? And then as they're moving at a much faster rate. So that's important to recognize, is that how are they moving to these new platforms and using technology in ways that, and they're reaching out to, or for example, they're using the Line, which a lot of people, again, haven't spent time thinking about. Line's a new sort of instant messaging app, very popular in Southeast Asia. It was developed in Japan, but like in a place like Indonesia, there's 90 million users of the Line. It's their version of WhatsApp. So my point is, again, is thinking through platform agility, where they're using what platforms and how to reach certain audiences. And that's important, which is where I hope, I've talked a lot about in my book as somebody who's a policy practitioner, somebody who I think of myself as a field person. I spent 9 years in South Asia and about 10 years in the Middle East, and I want to come up with solutions, and that's where I want to leave and to hopefully start our dialogue here today, is thinking about, okay, so now that we think about these key insights about audience segmentation, about sort of thinking about real-time feedback loops in terms of how they evolve quickly, and then platform agility in terms of the ways that they're able to leverage technology, how do we combat them on this information battlefield? And as I mentioned in the beginning, when we saw the pictures come out of Raqqa, a lot of us wanted to celebrate and say, look, they have been defeated on the physical battlefield. But what we didn't recognize is that on the battlefield that I think they care most about, they have made unexpected gains on this information battlefield, which includes social media of what we think about, but it also includes the dark web, deep web. It includes things that we may not understand as well, and things that are still new. There's a lot of research that shows that ISIS is even using Bitcoin and has thought about crowdsourcing in terms of how they raise money. And so again, you have to think about sort of how they're leveraging these new platforms. So on solutions, what to do. And in a lot of ways, the way I think about framing what to do is that we have a little bit of, and I'm a student of game theory, is we have what I call a collective action problem. It's a tragedy of the commons, that we have actually the best technologists. We have fantastic stories in terms of alternative pathways. We have a lot of the right ingredients. But what we don't have is we have a little bit of an issue in terms of motivating and bringing all these different pieces together. So what I say oftentimes first, and I talk about this in the book, in Digital World War, is that we almost need a new Manhattan Project. If we think about the race in the 1940s, about getting the best talent, we need that level of urgency to sort of combat them on the information battlefield. And what do I mean by that? Well, first is that, again, let's look at the data. What works? Well, what we do know works is that there is what I call alternative pathway narratives. So we know voices of victim narratives work well. We know voices of mothers are very influential. We know that voices of defectors, their stories are incredibly influential. So these are all things that we know that work. And those are we have to think about, how do we tell those stories? How do we get those stories to the light of day to sort of increase their impact? And when you hear a lot of the work on counter narratives, the one point I want to make is that there's this idea of what we call backfire effect. And backfire effect is that, sometimes when you think tit for tat in terms of counter narrative, so let's say Muhammad al-Arafi says the caliphate is bountiful. We're like, no, it's not bountiful. Well, you have to be careful, because oftentimes we can get into this trap of backfire effect, which is you can reinforce someone's predisposed belief by simply countering a narrative. So you have to think a little bit different in terms of an alternative, what I call alternative pathway. So these are the stories of like Malala and like the thousands of young people that I've met in the region and around the world. How do you tell their stories that are authentic, that are organic, that are, that is the sort of the idea behind this. How do you tell those stories? The second thing is that I think what I've seen also work in the data is what I call social media incubators. So these incubators, like there's a group based in Jeddah that I spent some time with called U-Turn, and they're fantastic. They're taking on ISIS sort of in a lot of ways, but they produce very edgy content. They use satire. They do sort of edutainment, because we can't forget that a lot of what makes ISIS influential is their sort of Game of Thrones approach. I mean, they actually had a video that was very akin to sort of approaching young people, using new media, using animation, using kind of drama using music. So you have to think about, and U-Turn was one of the best examples, there are many, of groups that are combating them. They have millions of views, but they're really taking them on. And they try videos, some of them don't work, they'll move on to do different things, but they directly tackle a lot of those narratives in a way that, again, I say is like alternative pathways. So in that umbrella of things, I think of things like in hackathons and these competitions. YouTube Spaces are very influential. They're one of the world's most popular YouTube Spaces now in Dubai, and they're producing a lot of, again, organic content. So the thing is that there are a lot of these potential vehicles, but how do you supercharge those efforts? And third, what I'll say is that there's the room in this umbrella of what I call computational propaganda. There are a lot of interesting ways of how you tackle them using sort of the new techniques, whether it's an AI or you're thinking about the role of bots. So, there's been some really interesting work done by Jigsaw and others in the space of sort of targeted ads. And so what they'll do is that Google will look at, what searches that people are putting in to sort of say, in Google, you might put in a search saying, well, how do I travel to Syria? And so there's those ads that come up on the right-hand side when you search, and there's ways to target those ads towards people that are looking for certain types of content. So that's one way to sort of think about reaching a very targeted audience. And there's other ways to do that in terms of diluting their content, and this is the part about content wars. But again, a whole basket of these techniques that are important. And one of the things that led me to is that if I was to describe our approach on the information battlefield, it's a little bit like a counterinsurgency approach. And I think in a lot of ways, my research shows that we need to move to what I call almost a public health approach to tackling the ISIS. And if you think about ISIS, as a way it spreads, it actually has a lot. It models what we see in the spread of like herpes, for example, that it spreads through intimate, close contact. There's actually, in some of my research and my data shows that you can actually calculate what I call viral coefficient. That's the replication and how something spreads when you look at the number of recruiters or the people that like pro-ISIS content online. And we have a lot to learn, I think, from public health field about now, it's not like somebody gets up in a public square and yells, join ISIS, and people join. No, it's very targeted, it's very nuanced. And so if you think about public health, one is that how does it spread? Two is that there's what I think of in hotspots. So a lot of times, you think about networks and neighborhoods. So a lot of foreign fighters, the research shows that it's highly localized. So one of the things I talk about is that all radicalization is local. So 80% of foreign fighters that came from Tunisia came from a neighborhood in Tunis. Majority of foreign fighters that came from Belgium came from a neighborhood in the southern part of Brussels. So actually, if you think about this in terms of hotspots, you have a better sense. And if we think of the city as the unit that we're trying to study and that we're sort of tackling, then we actually now, I think, are coming up with a more robust way to think about interventions and thinking about campaigns, because they have to be highly localized. And again, we have a lot to learn, I think, from the CDC and from public health folks. It may not jump out at us, but to me, that's a very interesting and fruitful way to think about intervention. So again, to sort of think about this blueprint, this new Manhattan Project, I think you have to think about alternative pathways. You have to think about social media incubators, which again, the data shows it works. And you have to think through about how to use both artificial intelligence, how you dilute content, how you scale up content in terms of coordinated campaigns, because all of this matters on the information battlefield. And I think, the urgency of this can't be understated. I think that the urgency of this, and really, otherwise we're going to find ourselves behind the curve. And as we are talking about ISIS, in a lot of ways, ISIS 2.0, 3.0 are already on the horizon. And we're left behind in this battle curve. Thank you so much.
Harun, thank you. Fantastic presentation, and I will abuse my position as chair to ask the first question. Some of your solutions, very convincing. Need to talk about local factors, local pathways to radicalization, and the response, I presume, also being somewhat local. I was wondering if you could apply some of the solutions you've talked about to a case like Mohammed al-Arafi. And I should also say Haroon has written a article in Politico about this ideologue very recently that I'd encourage you all to check out. But you've got somebody like that who obviously is very popular, as you point out. You point out in the book also that the Saudi government, even though he is a critic and an extremist cleric, they've also been able to use him at times, for example, with criticism of Qatar and how they've been able to utilize his message for their own purposes. Yet at the same time, this is the man who's drawing foreign fighters and people to the caliphate and obviously a very pernicious influence. How would you go about approaching that kind of problem?
It's a great question, Robin. I would say a couple of things. So one is understanding how he's successful. So on the face of it, he hasn't violated any terms of service. Otherwise, Twitter would have taken him off, right? So he's able to maintain this because he goes up to the line, but doesn't necessarily cross the line. He'll do things where he'll use a Robert Frost poem that we oftentimes know, "The Road Not Taken," and he'll just show a picture of that, suggesting that there's other path to success on that road not taken. Now, did he violate any terms of service? Not necessarily, but young people that oftentimes are reading it, they get motivated by some of the things that he says, and they naturally draw their conclusions about his support and what they should be doing, because he's rallying people, essentially saying, don't stay at home. Don't just sit there. Young people want to go out and do something. So that's an interesting thing about, again, how he's skillful. And that's why oftentimes when I'm in discussions with people and a lot of research, again, I think there's a role for taking content down. But we have to think through that in this content war, that's not going to be the panacea. That's not a solution in of itself, is just taking content. Because you see new groups that are evolving from ISIS, well, they're using coded language. They're using Nutella and kittens. So two of my favorite things. How are we going to start taking that down? So the point is that there's a role for taking content down, but they are evolving faster. And so we have to think about what's that language. So one is understanding how he's successful. Two is that we have to think about, in this sort of echo chamber, in terms of his audiences, who are the sort of anti-Muhammad al-Arafis. So there's another person called Ahmed Shigari. So he's an anti-Muhammad al-Arafi, but he's not nearly as high on his followers list. How do people support or build in civil society, build ecosystems, right, to help support some of his messaging? Because it's almost like, the way I think about it is like he's bringing a gun to the fight, Muhammad al-Arafi, and we're bringing a knife to the fight. So how do you match the intensity of the tools that he is using? And that's why these social incubators are important. But thinking about, again, who are the young, and I mention him as an extremist cleric, but I have to say the vast majority of clerics, they're actually on the front lines. You just never heard of them, or you don't hear about them because they don't have a platform, or they're not good at using social media. He's somebody that was sort of a third-rate preacher, would have never gotten a job in an urban area, but he realized that he understood social media in a way that could be his path to stardom. And so, who are the sort of people that are fighting against? I mean, there are many religious leaders very bravely on the front lines, but people like Shigari and others, but how do one amplify what they're doing, I think is very important. Two is that, you have to think about responding to some of his narratives. So young people are looking for content. So, what are the narratives that he's using to attract people and sort of combating those narratives? And then the part that Robin mentioned, I think is very smart, is that it shows you his influence, that in this sort of version of what I called Saudi Sopranos over the last month, in terms of a lot of the changes that MBS and leadership made there, that he's one of the few people that was spared, and that is not curtailed in the same sort of way. And that shows you his outsized influence. Because if he probably was, then there'd probably be even more backlash than there is now. And so, again, it shows to you how a lot of times these key influencers are either being co-opted by establishments, and recognizing that the messengers matter. So a lot of the messengers that may be associated with regimes may not be the best messengers for the message, right? So you think about it, because let's say you had the top cleric in Egypt, part of one of the longest, the oldest institutions, Al-Azhar, there. Well, he might be seen as part of the state establishment. So again, you have to find out who has independent, organic voices in civil society that can combat that message.
Great. I will go to the floor for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just do one at a time to start with, and we'll make sure we get everybody in.
Thank you. Terry Miller with the Heritage Foundation, and before that with the State Department. Could you talk a little bit about what institutional capacity the United States government either has or needs to have in order to effectively address these problems?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's a couple things. So one is that I talked about being nimble, the speed. You know, part of this is it's a network approach. So it takes a network to defeat a network. And so I think that at the State Department, let's take that for example, since you mentioned that, they have set up an entity that has the structure to try to sort of tackle this, the Global Engagement Center, which is an interagency body there that is it's congressionally mandated to tackle this type of propaganda. You know, I go back to what I said. You need a Manhattan Project. You know, so you know the budget for the Global Engagement Center, its earliest incarnation was about $5 million a couple years ago, and now I think it's up to around 40 plus million. But just to put that in perspective, and God bless our military, but our military band has about a budget about 400 plus million. And so, you know, so what I think about it is like, are we putting enough resources, right, enabling those structures to be successful? And part of it is, I think, again, increasing the recognition that this is the information battlefield. This is the new wave of, it's not just an ancillary, oh, it's information warfare, it's just something that is sort of on the back end, but this is actually the new sphere, as in military speak we call AOR. This is the new arena that we have to sort of that where our national security, sort of protect our national security rests. So that's one. Two is that I think we're only as good as our partners, and when I say partners, it's enabling. It can't be government alone. So it's about enabling civil society. It's about enabling the private sector and so this, to me, it's that's why I said it was tragedy of commons, because it's how do we motivate all these disparate and different stakeholders to come on board, because everybody can contribute. So one thing I talk about in the book is something called the 1-9-90 model. So on social media, when you think about the information battlefield, 1% of people are what I call key influencers, and they are the ones that create content. Right? So they're kind of the game changers. 9% are what I call curators of content. They share content, okay? These are like the soul pancakes of the world, if anyone has heard of soul pancakes, right? So they're the sort of 9%. 90%, which a lot of us fall into, are passive consumers, sort of consuming that information. So the idea is, how do you get that 90%? How do you get more of that 90% to move and to sort of be motivated, right? And that's why I talk about this Manhattan Project blueprint, because to me, that's where a lot of these organic stories are. That's the content wars, and that's what you need to mobilize.
Hi, Chris Prodzak from Homeland411.com. I had a question about law enforcement today, from DHS all the way down to local law enforcement. What parts of this do you think they are getting right now, and what areas do you think they could possibly improve themselves, maybe even at the local level, to address what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think there's a recognition in terms of what our law enforcement, the importance of it, and I have a lot of respect for a lot of our field agents that I've worked closely with that, that are, the cases they're dealing with oftentimes tend to be very immediate, that they're dealing with. And the big headline I would say is that, if I take part of what I said of the public health approach and the highly local approach, it really is like a city. We have to think about this in a city-wide model. There's not a cookie-cutter approach nationwide, or that it's about sort of city to city in a lot of ways. I think the Strong Cities, which is an example of a project that I think has worked really well in terms of linking cities together around the world to cooperate. But that's where those relationships matter. That matter in the communities of interest. So you're getting community leaders, religious leaders, you're getting law enforcement, and you're trying to dispel some of the miscommunication, because part of this, they have to work sort of in tandem. And in some places it works better than others. So I think there's a recognition of it. The one thing I would say, though, is that we're still a little siloed in the sense that we still think in this battlefield, there's no borders, right? And the way we're broken up is that we have a group that are focused on the homeland, and then we have a group that's focused on looking at our interests abroad. And to me, there's no borders anymore there, right? So when you think about this information battlefield, there's got to be stronger. And there used to be, I would almost think of, if you think of a nerve center, like a version of the Global Engagement Center, but that really harnessed some of the work that DHS and DOJ and FBI are doing, even syncing that up further, right? So thinking about that much more congruently, I think that to me is a key part. And I should mention also, just a quick, combining the questions, the very good questions, I work now at the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and I think a lot of the content that we're producing is on the front line. So if I talk about content wars, well, Broadcasting Board of Governors, we're producing 7,000 hours of TV broadcast a day in 60 countries. And a lot of our content is doing voices of victims through our Middle East Broadcasting Network. We came out with a new Boko Haram documentary that's very powerful, that tackles them directly in terms of those narratives. We have an extremism desk that is doing a lot of work that is like looking at this content and finding ways to produce content in a variety of important and key languages. Because to me, as I was mentioning, we don't need a country model anymore. We need a language-based model because there are no borders.
Hi, my name is Talia Abrams, and I'm a student at American University. My question is, what is the biggest impacts that Islamic extremists and cyber supremacy have on government, politics, and institutions? And if you can relate this to autonomy and capacity.
It's a very good question. And just make sure I understood it right. So you're saying, how do extremists change the political landscape in certain countries, like in international relations? So I would say a couple of ways. One is that, we oftentimes in the world of diplomacy, we've been used to dealing with state actors, and now you have the rise of non-state actors. And given that these non-state actors are now moving to an arena that is unfamiliar at times, but our intel community has been following this for a long time. But part of it is, how do we deal with? They're not looking necessarily to govern. So in a lot of ways, let's think about ISIS, right? ISIS wanted to govern. Part of what they wanted to say was different about them than Al-Qaeda was that they wanted to actually, they were interested in a lot of them, the reason their backgrounds as technocrats, they wanted to be able to govern. Well, you're gonna find over time, the 2.0 and 3.0, they're gonna want to be entirely virtual, right? Meaning it is about the information battlefield. Like they're not gonna want to be necessarily controlling any physical space per se, right? So their entire modus operandi is going to be on this information battlefield. So that changes the dynamics in terms of how do you interact with an actor that can't be found anywhere easily, right? So we're set up even in the way that we attack and the way we think about counterinsurgency. We still are set up in a way. Just recently, I would say, to give you a good example, our cyber command. In August, finally became a full unified command, right? That's just this August, if you think about that in terms of the way that we are organized. So we're sort of understanding this battlefield, and so to me, that's the biggest change, is going to be dealing with the rise of non-state actors, violent non-state actors that are competing on a very different battlefield.
Hi, my name is Lynn, and I was just wondering if your book kind of goes into, there's, I guess, the information wars in terms of winning people's hearts and minds, but what about how these terrorist groups are using social media to actually target, attacks, just kind of like a little bit more, dangerous than trying to get sympathy?
It's a great question. So and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, so you've seen them, and this is part of the idea of the platform agility, is that you've seen these groups for operational details and to planning operational things go to sort of these apps, these end-to-end encryption and ones that we know are, obviously like Telegram, but there's ones that we don't know, Riot and others that they're using. And so they're able to, in a disaggregated way, plan, virtually. And so you do see them using this more than just getting out information or recruiting, but actually planning, plotting, post-planning. And so it makes it tougher, right? So, I mean, one of the benefits you could say, but it's the flip side, is as they've moved off open source platforms where you can actually track and you can see, and oftentimes there's people that are in dialogue with them. As they move to sort of the deep and dark web, it becomes a lot harder to see what they're planning and where they're, as we call it, digital dust. Where are their footprints in this space? So I think it makes the job tougher, and it's why we have to be even more prepared.
Patrick Terrell, the Heritage Foundation. Do you think it is worthwhile to use increased resources to ramp up spy networks so we better know what they're doing from within on social network, or if they're making money on Bitcoin and that kind of thing, more clandestine operations within ISIS? Do you think that's worthwhile to do?
I mean, I think it's worthwhile. And our intelligence community does a great job. So in terms of, tracking a lot of the things and thinking about the new technologies and ways that we can garner what we call human intelligence and signal intelligence. But I keep coming back to, I think of it more of as a collective action issue, right? Because we're so siloed. So how do we leverage that information with the actors that we are trying to motivate and incentivize, the civil society actors that have the credibility, that are the key messengers, right? So to me, it's that, how are we building out that network? It's like we have all the assets and we actually have a lot of the information, but how do we execute? So to me, it's if I was to point one area, it's how do we bridge that gap? Because that to me is where you get places like U-Turn, where the next 10 U-Turns going to come from, because they're the ones on the front lines. If there's ways that we can support or amplify or encourage, or even these hackathons, right, where you have young people that are coming up with creative things, developing things. I mean, even we talked about Saraha. Well, there's going to be 10 new apps like that in the next 2 months, right? And so how can we get ahead of that curve of young people that are innovating and then are passionate, and they are, about tackling this hateful ideology?
Just to maybe expand on that, I think one of the other things that's interesting about some of your solutions to this is they tend to actually be private sector driven primarily, rather than. So where do you see the role of government in this? Is it behind the scenes, seed money, amplifying where possible, but taking a backward step? Or, I mean, how do you see that balance?
Government, I think, plays a key role. Oftentimes they can help, as government can help overcome the collective action problem. And oftentimes they do it in smart ways, like almost like a venture capital approach of seeding money to small efforts, right? And seeing if they get scaled up. So a lot of the most successful, I would say, public diplomacy efforts that are run, let's say, from the State Department, were giving out small seed grants to groups that scaled up, did well, and then ended up getting money for the private sector and civil society and other international partners. So because the thing is that what the U.S. government can do is we can take chances on projects when no one else, I call it first mover advantage. We can take chances on certain projects in certain places where the private sector won't fund it or the civil society won't fund it. And that way, we're sort of an early stage investor. And so to me, it's like, how do we find those projects? We have fantastic officers in the field, thousands of public diplomacy officers that are out there in almost every country, and we have embassies and consulates. But how do we leverage? It's almost like if you think about it, if you're running a media network, you have stringers on the ground. They have, if you think about information asymmetry, they have the best sense of what's going on the ground in terms of what these groups are thinking, what things might work. So how do we better leverage some of their insight?
I think I saw two hands. Why don't I take the two questions together? So, gentleman in the middle row there, and then we'll go to you, Sarah.
Ben Runkle, Artists International. I was wondering if you would share your thoughts regarding the dual-use nature, what policy should be regarding the double-edged sword of encryption, specifically that many of the groups that we hope to empower in the Middle East, dissident groups, human rights groups, democracy activists, rely on encryption to be able to get around repressive governments. At the same time, as you said with Saraha, that terrorist groups also exploit those same technologies. So if we help in the breaking of that encryption, we're therefore also at the same time risking undermining those other policy objectives. So just was curious as to how you saw the trade-offs and what policy should be towards that.
Rob Whitmore. I appreciated your remarks about the 1%, the 9%, and the 90%, the creators, the curators, and the consumers. And it reminded me of the importance of writing to influence and to persuade. You know, Americans have become so caught up in thinking, reading, researching, and analyzing, and writing to inform, that if we're fortunate to get to a point of writing to evaluate, we never seem to reach writing to persuade, which is what it sounds as though the cultural battle that we're fighting is really capitalizing on as a dominant competitive advantage. I just thought I'd toss that out there and see if you could run with that.
Absolutely. Well, both really good questions. It's a tough issue, and sort of where I think about it is that I tend to lean that we have to protect, obviously, freedom of speech, and that outlet allowing for the safety. And I obviously work in an organization where we've had journalists of ours we have journalists of ours that are in jail. We have journalists of ours that have been killed. We have journalists that are under constant threat all over the world. And so how we can protect storytelling, because it's such a valuable work that they're doing, I think is key, because, you know, other governments don't share that idea, you know, with censorship and wanting to control what those stories are. So I tend to lean that, you see, the thing is that the technology is moving so quickly, so that even if you you relax things around encryption, I can tell you, having studied this and gone through it very carefully, they're working on end arounds. They're working on new technology that we even can't pronounce. You know, we know encryption, but a lot of things that they're working on. So it's kind of like the way I think about censorship. Like, yes, there's a role, and Facebook just came out with, you know, Monica Beckert, who I think very highly of. She does fantastic work running global policy for Facebook. Talked about how some of the recent data on artificial intelligence now in terms of taking content down. So it's improving kind of, you know, exponentially in terms of recognizing ISIS content and taking it down before it even gets to a wider audience. So there's improvements being made there. But the way I think about it, there's a role for that, but it's still a content war. So I almost want us to put more focus on getting the stories of the young Malalas, 1,000 of Malalas we haven't heard of, or the scholars that are the anti-Arafis, or, you know, creating the new Sarahas that people are motivated by tackling this, you know, in their work and in terms of innovation and developing new platforms. I think that's where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I tend to think, yes, on the technology side, and we have ways, say domestically, where, you know, where the tech companies are served a search warrant or they're served certain legal, and then oftentimes they cooperate with law enforcement. And I think that's when in those certain cases, those work well. But again, I think the focus is on this other side, which is on the content wars and how do we enable new stories and others that are out there that are not being heard. Great point on this idea of informing, and because to me what that strikes me as is this idea of the customer journey and really understanding. And part of what I try to write about was really, and even in my earlier books, was how do you understand why it is young people would do something like this? And if you can try to put yourself in their shoes and you start reading the propaganda that they see, you see their disillusionment, you better understand actually how to tackle it. So to me, that what you said, I agree 100%. That's the hallmark of persuasion. And too often we think of in terms of counter narratives, which again, as I said, the backfire effect is very real. And we oftentimes fall ourselves into that sort of tweeting at terrorists type of mindset. So I think it's important not to fall in that trap and to think about what you said, which is more nuanced, and which is actually the direction that we should be headed in.
Sorry to ask a second question. It's Terry Miller again with Heritage Foundation. Are there any partisan differences in approach that hamstring U.S. efforts on this, or is there pretty much a bipartisan consensus about what needs to be done?
You know, I tend to think that there's, you know, and I worked in, I was on Secretary Tillerson's policy planning staff. Had worked at state for many years, like yourself. I think there's a bipartisan approach. I think actually keeping us safe and, you know, working every day to sort of think about ways to protect U.S. national security it's very bipartisan. And in fact, I just think that we haven't thought about, we're not set up ideally to tackle this information battlefield. But there's so much willing interest. I mean, you won't get any closed doors. On a lot of my colleagues on the military side, whether it's at SOCOM, at the Pentagon, they are ready and willing. They have always been very open about working and doing partnerships together. I see one of my old colleagues here from Pakistan. We used to work together on informational countering extremism in South Asia when I used to work at the embassy. So to me, and same on the intelligence side, but you know, who's pulling this all together with the civil society and private sector? That to me is the bigger thing that we need to unlock. And so I think that's the key. And you know, as we wrap up, I'll just leave you with writing this book and actually interviewing a lot of defectors. I mean, it's not easy, and it's a lot of like reading the news when you see things happening in Syria. You see all the sort of things that are going on. You see the Halloween attack and other attacks. You saw the massacre in Egypt, the horrific tragedy over this past week. It can be very depressing, and it can really get you down. But I'm always reminded, I think back to my days in South Asia, there's a famous poet there named Muhammad Iqbal, and he had a great line, and I want to leave you with that. And he said, "Don't get frightened by the furious, violent winds, O eagle. Don't get frightened by the furious, violent winds, O eagle. They only blow to make you fly higher." And I think part of, I hope, my role, and as all of us together, is thinking about how we can put together this new Manhattan Project, because it's not just important for today, but for future generations. Thank you so much.